when Justice Clarence Thomas interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-hearing. He thought authority would be enough to rattle her. What he didn't expect was to be escorted out by federal agents less than an hour later. It was just past 9 a.m. when the courtroom doors closed behind Crockett. Her black heels struck the polished floor with calm precision, each step echoing like a metronome counting down to confrontation. She didn't glance around. She didn't need to. She knew the room was watching. Every seat in the press box was filled. Legal scholars, Hill staffers, retired judges, all packed into the public gallery. At the bench sat the bipartisan panel overseeing the investigation into judicial ethics. That alone was unusual. But what made this hearing different? What stirred murmurs and flashes from the gallery? It's the presence of someone no one expected to appear in person. Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, chin tilted ever so slightly, blank-faced, not bored, not engaged. Just unreadable, the kind of expression that says nothing but invites speculation. No aides, no entourage, just him. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had been told he might come. What she hadn't expected was for him to seat himself in plain view, like a challenge. She reached the front. A staffer handed her the latest forensic verification report. Jasmine skimmed it, lips tightening slightly, then tucked it into her leather folder. She already knew the key facts by heart. The chairwoman gavelled the hearing to order. This committee is now in session. Today, we will hear testimony from Representative Jasmine Crockett regarding potential ethical violations, undeclared gifts, and undisclosed property transactions by members of the federal judiciary. Crockett stood. No preamble. No theatrics. Thank you, Madam Chair. I came here today because I believe no branch of government, regardless of rank, tenure, or title, is above scrutiny. I bring documentation that raises concerns every American should care about, regardless of party. She opened her folder and placed a photo face up on the table. A satellite image of a beachfront estate in southern Florida. Pristine lawn. Private. Dock luxury vehicles parked under a stone archway. The property you see here is legally owned by an offshore trust. She said registered to an entity sharing a business address with a political donor who has appeared in at least 6 Supreme Court amicus briefs. A low ripple spread across the room. Jasmine continued, undeterred. Financial documents obtained via subpoena showed $267,000 in renovations and security upgrades on this property, none of which appear in official disclosures. That's when Clarence Thomas rose from his seat. The scrape of his chair was louder than expected, drawing every eye toward him. Phones came out. Few reporters lifted their pens. "Excuse me," Thomas said. His tone was controlled, but rigid. "I do not appreciate the insinuations being made in this chamber. I came here to observe testimony, not to be publicly accused without merit." The chairwoman raised her hand. "Justice Thomas, with all due respect, you are not a witness at this hearing. Please remain seated." But he didn't sit. His voice rose, if only slightly. "This is a political stunt," he said. "The Congresswoman is manufacturing controversy for attention. Nothing she's presented is verified." Jasmine waited a moment. Then she turned toward him. "That's not accurate, Justice Thomas," she said, even and composed. "The documentation I presented was verified just 46 minutes ago by the Office of Forensic Financial Review. I'm prepared to submit the full report into the record, along with authentication logs and timestamps." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He watched her, trying to read her face, searching for hesitation. There was none. A committee member broke the silence. "I'd like to request the Congresswoman's documentation be entered into evidence." The chairwoman nodded. "So ordered." Jasmine slid the folder across the table. A clerk collected. It began scanning the pages. Thomas finally sat down, his mouth drawn into a tight line. But the room had shifted. Attention no longer split. All eyes were now on Crockett. She sipped water, glanced at her notes. No showmanship. No pause for effect. Just the facts. She was ready to keep going, but Thomas stood again, this time slower. "I'm sorry, Madam Chair." He spoke, barely concealing the irritation in his voice. "But I have a right to defend myself. These accusations aren't just reckless, they're defamatory." A few people in the front row shifted uncomfortably. The chairwoman didn't. Miss a beat. Her voice was sharper now. "Justice Thomas, this is a formal hearing. You were neither subpoenaed nor invited to participate. If you choose to speak, you do so at your own legal risk." Still, Thomas didn't sit. He stepped forward. Not far, just enough to draw the room's full attention. "This representative," he said, gesturing toward Jasmine without meeting her eyes, "is constructing a distorted narrative based on incomplete, second-hand documents. I have never accepted gifts or property in a manner that violates disclosure. Laws, any suggestion otherwise, is a smear." Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned slightly into her microphone. "If that's true, then I'm sure you won't mind answering a few basic questions under oath." It landed hard. Eyes snapped up. Representative Crockett, but Jasmine pressed on, calm and clear. "Has the justice, or any member of his immediate family, stayed at that property more than once in the past 12 months? If so, who paid for its upkeep? Who covered the taxes? Who arranged the renovations?" Thomas's jaw tensed. His hands were locked behind his back. "That's irrelevant," he said. "I'm not obligated to disclose properties I do not personally own." Jasmine sat forward, not aggressive, just firm. "You are obligated to disclose benefits received in connection with your position, repeatedly staying at a luxury property maintained by a politically connected donor, especially one involved in cases before the court constitutes a benefit." The room began to stir again, but the sound was different now. Less disbelief. More realization. One panelist tapped his pen against the table. Another leaned back and whispered to his aide, motioning for a copy of financial disclosure codes. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "This hearing will proceed in order. Representative Crockett, please continue your statement." "Justice Thomas, you may observe but may not participate unless formally invited." Thomas didn't move. His eyes locked onto Jasmine. "You want a headline?" he said. "And you're willing to burn the court's credibility to get it." She didn't rise. "To the bait," Jasmine said. "What I want is a system where power doesn't protect people from the truth." Then, for the first time, she raised her voice, not in anger, but with piercing clarity. Because when a Supreme Court justice is living in a mansion owned by someone whose financial empire relies on court rulings, that's not a paperwork error. That's not a misunderstanding. That's rot. This time, the reaction wasn't from the public gallery. It came from the panel itself. Two members exchanged quiet remarks. In the press section, a reporter began typing furiously. Phones buzzed, alerts already being drafted. Thomas finally sat, slowly, stiffly, not defiant now, but different. A man registering that the tide might be deeper than he thought. Jasmine's voice softened. "No one wants to be in this room. For this reason," she said. "I grew up believing in the integrity of this court. I still want to. But belief means accountability. And right now, public trust in the judiciary is eroding not because people hate the law, but because they see those in power playing by different rules." The chairwoman gave a quiet nod. "I request that the committee prepare the witnesses, materials for forensic review and internal analysis. If there is any violation of federal code, this panel is obligated to refer it forward." A beat passed. Then she looked back to Jasmine. Anything further before we recess? Jasmine tapped one last document in her folder. A wire transfer sheet. A final item, she said. Offshore movement of funds from a Delaware-based LLC to a bank in the Bahamas. Same account that funded the Florida property. She looked up. I'd ask that you don't recess just yet, because there's one more transfer, dated 5 weeks ago. It didn't go through until this morning's review. The room stilled. This one wasn't for renovations. It was for private security, not for the property, for a person. A ripple moved across the table. Even Thomas shifted in his seat. His expression wasn't angry now. It was something colder, quieter. Calculation, and Jasmine saw it. The chairwoman turned toward the committee clerk, who immediately moved to collect the document. The air in the chamber felt unusually dense, not tense, just unnaturally quiet, as if the room itself was waiting to see what came next. The page being passed hand to hand wasn't long. Single sheet. Transaction records, recipient names, timestamps, and one line that caught every eye. Memo, exec security, confidential. Jasmine remained still, hands folded, gaze steady. Across the room, Thomas leaned back, not slouched, not resistant, just still. And maybe, for the first time that morning, uncertain. That's when a panel member from Arizona, a former financial prosecutor, raised his voice. Representative Crockett. Was the transfer made directly from a donor's account? The panelist asked. Jasmine nodded. Yes, but through a shell company, Sheridan Partners LLC. We tracked it to a holding firm based in Austin, which shares legal counsel with a known donor. That same donor has submitted 3 separate amicus briefs in recent Supreme Court cases involving regulatory oversight. She paused only a beat before continuing. He's also been photographed at the Florida property in question, alongside members of Justice Thomas's family. The murmurs were instant louder now. Audible reactions echoed across the chamber. Walls. The Arizona panelist narrowed his eyes. You're saying this shell company paid for the justice's private security? Yes, Jasmine said plainly. Just 5 weeks ago, a $28,000 payment was issued from that LLC to a personal protection firm based in Miami. The assignment wasn't to a property. It was to a named client, Clarence Thomas. The panelist let out a quiet breath and leaned back in his chair, and in that single movement, the room understood. The facts were no longer vague. They were undeniable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the presiding judge on the ethics panel leaned forward. Her voice was slow and clear. I've seen enough to recommend that these documents be reviewed for possible violations, both of federal disclosure law and of ethics guidelines regarding conflicts of interest. At that exact moment, a U.S. Marshal posted at the back of the room stepped forward. He said nothing. He didn't reach for anything, just moved close enough to be seen, his hand resting calmly near his jacket. Thomas saw him. So did everyone else. He straightened in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, silent. Jasmine didn't look at him. She addressed the panel instead. This isn't about partisanship, she said quietly. And it's not personal. But if the highest legal authority in the country can receive luxury perks and private security from individuals with legal interests before the court and never be questioned for it. She let the silence finish the sentence. Then the message we send the public is clear. The law is for them, not for us. A woman in the third row, dressed in a gray blazer, nodded solemnly. A man beside her followed suit. The presiding judge spoke again. Clerk, prepare a sealed motion for judicial review and immediate transmission to the Department of Justice. This hearing is not over. But this portion is now formally escalated to the appropriate oversight authority. The clerk stood without hesitation and walked briskly toward a side door near the bench. Justice Thomas still said nothing. No objections, No interruptions, just silence and stillness. The chairwoman spoke again, her tone now gentler. Representative Crockett, your cooperation today has met every standard for transparency. This panel thanks you. Jasmine gave a brief nod, then slowly rose. Her fingertips brushed the folder as she prepared to leave the witness chair. But she didn't move just yet. She turned slightly, looking out at the crowd. The law only works, she said, because people believe it applies to everyone. The moment that belief collapses, everything else does too. Then she stepped back. An aide stepped in to help gather the documents. Her pace was calm, her expression steady. But just as she descended from the platform, another figure stood, this time from the back of the room. It wasn't Thomas, it was a tall man in a blue jacket, plain clothes. Law enforcement, clearly. He walked down the center aisle, flashing credentials briefly toward the bench. The presiding judge didn't hesitate. "Proceed," she said. He approached the panel quietly, leaned in and handed the judge a slim folder. She reviewed it, whispered something in return, then nodded once. Then she addressed the courtroom. "We are entering a brief recess. All parties are to remain present. This hearing is now a joint session under federal oversight." No one moved. Not the reporters, not the aides, not even the janitor who had slipped in sometime during the second hour. The judge's words, "joint session under federal oversight," hung over the room like a sealed door, and every eye turned once again to Justice Clarence Thomas. He still hadn't spoken. The noise hadn't risen, but something in the room had shifted. You could feel it. Jasmine Crockett, now seated beside her legal advisor, tapped her pen lightly against her folder. Not from nerves, but timing. Then she leaned slightly toward her advisor and spoke. She whispered something brief and received a silent nod in return. Behind the bench, the clerk who had stepped out minutes earlier re-entered, carrying a sealed envelope. The presiding judge took it, opened it without a word, scanned the contents, then placed it face down beside her. Still, she didn't speak. Instead, she looked up, eyes sweeping across the courtroom. From the gallery to the press row. From the committee panel to the far end of the room, where a second plainclothes officer now stood by the exit. Justice Clarence Thomas finally moved. His posture shifted slightly, hands now resting loosely in his lap. But the quiet authority he usually commanded, judicial, intellectual, even personal, felt absent. And he knew it. It was the Arizona panelist who broke the stillness. "For the record," he said, "has anyone from the Federal Investigative Division present in this room submitted a warrant or formal action request?" The man in the blue jacket took a step forward. "Yes, sir. A sealed motion was filed at 10 a.m. Eastern. Judge reviewed and signed it at 10:39. Enforcement is scheduled. Pending confirmation of protocol compliance from this panel." The energy in the room didn't shift in volume, but it did in tension. Even Thomas sat up straighter now. The chairwoman spoke next. "This committee confirms protocol has been followed. We are now in receipt of the Justice Department's request and accompanying validation." An aide beside her passed up a second document. She read it, then gave a single, decisive nod. Her voice, when it came again, was heavier than before. "This panel is hereby suspending the current ethics hearing under the authority of Section 2 of the Judicial Oversight Review Statute. Enforcement officers may proceed with notice and detention." "No," one shouted. No one scrambled. The two U.S. Marshals moved in quiet synchrony, one from the side aisle, the other from near the rear exit. Smooth, precise. They didn't touch Thomas. Not yet. One of them addressed him directly, voice low but formal. "Justice Thomas, we are executing a federal order related to obstruction of justice and non-disclosure of financial transactions involving active legal conflicts. We request that you come with us voluntarily." For a long few seconds, Thomas said nothing. Then, finally, "I want to speak to my attorney before I move from this bench." The lead marshal replied without hesitation, "That conversation will be made available at the enforcement office. You are not under arrest at this exact moment, but we are prepared to proceed within the next 3 minutes should you choose. Not to comply, 3 minutes. It doesn't sound long until you're sitting inside it." Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't smirk, didn't blink. Just kept her eyes forward, locked on the bench in the press row. Someone whispered into a phone mic, "This is happening live. I repeat, Clarence Thomas is being served in court." Thomas slowly reached for the side of his chair, stood, and turned toward the bench. "I dispute the basis of these claims," he said. The presiding judge gave him no reply, no expression, just silence. He turned to the marshal. "I will comply voluntarily, but I will be seeking a public hearing immediately." The marshal nodded. Understood. Thomas stepped away from the bench. No uproar followed, no shouting. The room froze, still focused. The moment was too large for noise as he moved toward the side door flanked by the officers. Cameras began to click. Slow at first, then rapidly. A ripple of energy swept through the courtroom like wind across tall grass. Heads turned, hands covered mouths. Phones lifted, the door shut behind him. No slam, no chains. Just the thick, final weight of something irreversible. Back at the bench, the chairwoman cleared her throat. "This panel will reconvene in 48 hours for a closed review session. All media inquiries are to be directed to the Federal Press Office. Representative Crockett, thank you for your cooperation." Jasmine gathered her notes, fingers pausing briefly on the folder. Before she stepped away, she looked up at the flag behind the bench, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it meant what it was supposed to. Outside in Greenbelt, Maryland, a slow-moving crowd had begun to gather. Most didn't yet know what had happened inside, but the look on one intern's face, sprinting from the courthouse, phone to his ear, was enough to draw attention. Within minutes, rumor turned into headlines. Inside the building, Jasmine Crockett had entered a small side room reserved for legal counsel and key witnesses. Her folder lay open on the table, pages still warm from the scanner. Her legal advisor, Rena Tolbert, seasoned, sharp, and calm, broke the silence. "You know what's coming next, right?" Jasmine gave a small nod. But I don't think they do." Rena leaned forward. "They're going to paint this as personal, political, dangerous. You'll be the villain by dinner." Jasmine didn't flinch. She picked up a document from the table and ran her thumb across its edge. "It was never personal," she said. "I didn't accuse him. The evidence did." Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Clarence Thomas was being quietly escorted down a concrete hallway. No cuffs, no cameras. Just footsteps, echoing. They stopped at a conference room, waited. His attorney, Emmett Lang, arrived, sharp suit, sharper instincts, and a folder so thick it looked like it had been ready for this day for months. Inside, Thomas finally exhaled, not relief, just breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Lang sat down across from him and got straight to it. "They've got verified financial records, time-stamped transfers, and corroborated testimony. Statements from the contractors who worked on the property had confirmed it." Lang didn't sugarcoat it. "Our only real option now is to challenge the process itself and cast doubt on their motivations." Thomas didn't answer right away. He was still replaying the moment in his head. "She was too calm," he finally said, like she already knew where this was going. Lang pushed away from the table, crossing his arms. "She probably did," he said, "but we're not folding. Today." Upstairs, the courthouse was swelling with press. Reporters, photographers, and camera crews now crowded the hallway shoulder to shoulder. A Fox reporter called out above the din, "Can anyone confirm whether the justice was arrested mid-session?" Another voice, this one from NPR, followed. "Is the judiciary still legitimate after this level of scandal?" Meanwhile, in the official media room, federal spokesperson Denise McAllister stood before the cameras. "There was no arrest during the proceedings," she said carefully. "What took place was a federal enforcement action executed under judicial oversight. Justice Thomas cooperated and has been escorted for further review. It was technically accurate, but everyone listening knew what it meant." In the witness holding room, Jasmine rose from her seat. She crossed to the tall window and looked out over the sea of reporters below. From here, the crowd didn't seem angry, just unsettled, unsure of how to react. Rena joined her at the window. "Get ready. This is going to get personal, fast. They'll come for your motives." "I know," Jasmine replied. Rena turned to look at her. "Then why don't you look more worried?" Jasmine gave a soft shrug. "Because if we don't do this now, the damage is permanent. There is no later for this one." She wasn't wrong. Across the news cycle, clips of Jasmine grilling federal witnesses were already being aired against him, painted her as fearless, others as aggressive or self-serving. The usual split, but none of it could erase what now existed in the official record. Real evidence. Evidence that couldn't be spun, shouted over, or scrubbed in another room. A federal compliance. Officers scanned a barcoded file and uploaded it directly into the DOJ's secure database. The file showed 6 separate transactions from Veritan Partners LLC within 13 months, none of which were disclosed on Justice Thomas's official financial reports. Each transfer came with a label: maintenance, guest service, renovation. Final holiday hosting, legal liaison, exec security, confidential. The timestamps matched Jasmine's testimony exactly. It was the kind of precision defense teams hated because it couldn't be argued away. But even more than the paper trail, it was the image that stuck. Thomas, quiet, compliant, walking out of the courtroom without a fight. That left a mark. Downstairs, one marshal filled out a new intake form. Another agent, flipping through evidence sheets, asked under his breath, "How did she stay that calm up there?" Back in the main courtroom, things hadn't calmed, they had crystallized. The committee hadn't adjourned. Members remained at the bench, sorting through documents that had flipped the entire morning on its head. At the far end, the same clerk returned once more, holding a sealed motion stamped in gray with the DOJ insignia. This one hadn't come from Jasmine, came straight from the Department of Justice. The presiding judge broke the seal, read the top section silently, and looked up. "We've received a supplemental motion," she said. "The Department of Justice is requesting an immediate protective hold," she continued, her tone unwavering. "The agency asserts that the current evidence qualifies under active conflict review. The motion seeks formal restrictions on the destruction, removal, or alteration of any records related to this investigation." She turned to her court assistant. "Mark this motion as reviewed, time-stamped, and included in the official record." The assistant nodded and left to file the motion. From the gallery, a reporter leaned into her phone mic and whispered, "A protective hold has just been placed on all documents linked to the Thomas investigation." This is real-time escalation. There was no walking it back now. At that exact moment, Jasmine Crockett stepped quietly back into the main courtroom. She hadn't expected to return so soon, but the whispered mention of a new DOJ filing had drawn her back. She paused at the entrance, scanning the room. When the chairwoman spotted her, she gave a quick nod. "Representative Crockett, you're welcome to remain. We've entered administrative session." Jasmine nodded and slipped into a seat near the back, second row. She said nothing, just watched. One of the panel members leaned forward toward his mic. "Madam Chair, I recommend the committee begin drafting an interim statement to the Office of Judicial Review. The gravity of the evidence paired with the justice's previous resistance to questioning requires immediate action. We have to move before this explodes politically. The chairwoman tapped her pen against the table. A tin will need to choose our words carefully. An Arizona representative spoke next. Let's start with what's undeniable. The documents from this morning have been verified. The financial trail is real. The conflict is clear. That's enough, he added, to move this from an administrative issue to a prosecutorial one. Another panelist shifted uncomfortably. We also have to weigh public perception. If this gets painted as political theater, we risk losing the broader trust. From her seat, Jasmine finally spoke calmly, but clearly. It already is political. Everything in this room is, but the law doesn't have to be. Heads turned. She continued, if you're afraid of appearing biased, you're giving bias more power than the truth. If this involved anyone else, any lower judge, any civil servant, the process would already be underway. The only thing slowing us down is the robe and the title. The chairwoman watched her for a moment, then turned back to the panel. We'll begin drafting the referral. I want all supporting material compiled by end of day. Every transaction, every timestamp, every contractor statement. The record must be airtight. As the session moved into formal recess, the hum from the hallway grew louder. Camera lights now flickered through the frosted glass, casting glints across the courtroom walls, like a second storm pressing in from outside. A court officer stepped forward and pulled the heavy doors shut. The noise faded again, but the tension didn't. Jasmine rose slowly, walking down the aisle. She passed the bench, offering a respectful nod to the chair, and moved toward the exit. As she neared the row of reporters, one leaned slightly forward and whispered, too quietly for the mics to catch, "Did you expect it to get this far?" Jasmine paused, mid-step, and turned just enough to answer. "I expected worse," she said. "Because I've seen what happens when power thinks it's untouchable." She didn't wait for a reply. She just kept walking at the front of the chamber. A panel aide carefully gathered the documents Jasmine had submitted, double-checking that each page bore an official verification seal. One of the Florida property photos had a bent corner, likely from being passed between too many hands. The aide gently flattened it before slipping it into the evidence envelope. But in the end, it wasn't the photo or the transfer records that people would remember. It was the moment a sitting Supreme Court justice lost his silence and then his control. Outside, the courthouse had erupted. News vans lined the curbs too deep. Boom mics extended over barricades. Protest signs waved in the sweltering July heat, some held high for Jasmine Crockett, others defending Clarence Thomas. The whispers had become shouts. Inside, though, the atmosphere was stark, cold, that institutional kind of quiet only found in federal buildings where history is made in sealed rooms. On the third floor, in one such room, Clarence Thomas sat at the head of a narrow metal table. Emmett Lang, seated beside him, scribbled notes while speaking urgently into his phone, likely to someone from the Federal Judicial Review Board. Across from them sat two federal attorneys and a compliance officer from the Office of the Inspector General. No press, no cameras, just law. "This isn't a deposition," Lang said, voice hard. "It's a witch hunt in legal clothing. We'll be filing to challenge the basis of this hold within 24 hours. The compliance officer, lean and expressionless, opened a binder and slid a single sheet forward. "Mr. Lang, your client is not under arrest, but this is a federal hold," he said. "It's based on violations of the Judicial Disclosure Integrity Act. This hold is temporary pending formal arraignment. Depending on DOJ's next step, a formal arrest may follow." Thomas didn't look at the page. He simply asked, "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be arrested for obstruction. the officer said flatly. "And this conversation won't. Stay quiet." Silence followed. Then, slowly, Thomas picked up the document, read it, signed it. "Okay." Didn't stop him. Downstairs, U.S. Marshals began forming a quiet perimeter. The word had been passed internally. The justice would be escorted out in 10 minutes. No cuffs, no remarks. Just a walk. But once he exited the building, everything would change. A court photographer stood waiting behind the officers, not for media, but for documentation. In a nearby room, Jasmine Crockett stood beside a federal liaison being debriefed. "You don't have to stay for this," the woman said quietly. "Your testimony is complete." But Jasmine shook her head. "People should see what justice looks like when it's equal, even if it's only once." Then the holding room door opened. Thomas stepped out first. His jacket was back on, his posture held, but whatever force had once made him feel untouchable, that was gone. What remained was a man walking through the consequences of his own actions. The hallway was lined with courthouse personnel. Some gave curt nods. Others couldn't meet his eyes. At the far end, a side exit had been cleared, a quiet route to avoid the crowd out front. That had been the plan. But plans buckle under pressure. A single reporter caught movement through a third-floor window and shouted, "There he is." In seconds, the crowd outside surged. Barricades groaned, camera rigs swung like weapons, and officers scrambled to contain the tide. Inside, Jasmine remained still, watching through the glass as Thomas passed. She didn't smile, didn't speak. Someone behind her murmured, "Think. He regrets coming." She answered softly, without turning. "No, he regrets losing." Outside, the door swung open and flashbulbs cracked like thunder. Reporters screamed his name. Protesters hurled accusations. Supporters shouted for answers. Thomas said nothing. A federal agent walked beside him, hand resting near his hip. Not a threat, just a presence. Thomas descended the courthouse steps. With slow, deliberate steps, inside, Jasmine turned away from the window. She didn't need to see the rest. She already knew. Upstairs, the panel reconvened, reviewing a new set of disclosures linked to the Florida property. The DOJ's command post pinged again another flagged transaction. Veridan Partners LLC was now a red alert in 3 separate federal systems. On TV, the headline rolled across the screen. Breaking, Justice Clarence Thomas escorted from federal courthouse amid ethics allegations, but that wouldn't be the final story. Because somewhere, someone else had just realized they might be next. The moment Thomas stepped outside, everything shifted. Newsrooms rewrote entire rundowns. Anchors who had spent the morning discussing gas prices were now reading statements on judicial ethics and constitutional law. By noon, every major network had cleared their top-of-the-hour segments. CNN ran a split screen. Jasmine Crockett seated with calm precision on the left, Clarence Thomas being escorted from the courthouse. On the right, MSNBC brought in law professors. Fox News called it a political hit job. Social media exploded. Hashtags erupted. Hashtag Justice on Trial, hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas, hashtag Judicial Crisis, and in the eye of it, all Jasmine Crockett. She didn't rush to the cameras. She didn't make herself available for interviews. Her team froze all press access and funneled requests through official House channels. No spin, no sound bites, just silence. And that silence said more than any headline. Across the country, people reacted. In a barbershop in Oakland, an older man stared at the footage. "I didn't think I'd live to see someone check the Supreme Court," he said. In a Pittsburgh living room, a mother turned to her daughter. "You see that woman? That's what calm power looks like." At a Michigan law school, students debated due process, oversight, and whether any justice should stand above the law. Some thought Jasmine had gone too far. Others argued she hadn't gone far enough. But the loudest message came from Thomas himself by what he didn't say. He hadn't denied the allegations. He hadn't accused anyone. He hadn't defended himself in front of cameras. And that silence started to echo. By evening, one particular clip was already airing again. Jasmine's line from the hearing, "If this was about anyone else, the process would already be moving." It hit harder the second time. In the court of public opinion, the fault lines deepened. Thomas supporters demanded investigations into the Oversight Committee, calling it a political vendetta. Right-wing commentators accused Jasmine of abusing her power. But many saw something else entirely. They saw restraint. Saw a woman who hadn't shouted, hadn't grandstanded. She had just refused to back down. She hadn't made it about herself. She had presented the facts, set them on the table, and let the silence in the room do the rest. That's what made her dangerous to some and a hero to others. Inside the Department of Justice, senior officials finalized a statement. The language was cautious, dry, the kind designed to avoid headlines, but the meaning was unmistakable. Following a thorough review of newly authenticated financial records and confirmed conflicts of interest, the Department of Justice has opened a formal inquiry into potential violations of federal judicial conduct statutes by Justice Clarence Thomas. This process remains active and adheres strictly to legal protocol. That evening, the White House press secretary was asked if the president had seen the footage. She answered simply, "He has, and he believes transparency and accountability are non-negotiable across all branches of government." By morning, the national mood had shifted again. Editorials began filling front pages. The Boston Globe asked, "How long has this been happening?" The Dallas Morning News ran, "Not above the Lavin in robes." The Seattle Times framed it differently. "A quiet woman, a loud message." Meanwhile, over 7,000 messages flooded Jasmine Crockett's office inbox. Some were hateful. Some were threats. But many were just ... thankful. One email stood out from a retired judge in Oregon. "I never thought I'd live to see a member of Congress hold the court accountable with such grace. You didn't grandstand. You didn't turn it into a spectacle. You stood still, let the truth speak. That's rare. Thank you." Jasmine read it twice. That same day, a producer from a primetime network show offered her a full hour of national airtime, just her, a camera, and a set. She turned it down. Not yet. Because this wasn't about airtime. It wasn't about scoring points. It was about cracking something open that had stayed sealed far too long. And now that it was open, the country was watching, waiting to see what would come out next. By the third day, Jasmine could barely make it down the Rayburn Building hallway without someone stopping her. Colleagues, interns, Capitol Police officers. Some offered support. A few offered advice she hadn't asked for. Others just stared like they weren't sure whether to cheer or keep their distance. She let most of it pass. When she entered her office that morning, it was quiet. No TV, no phones ringing. Just Rena at her desk, already sorting a tall stack of manila folders. "You've got a flood of interview requests," Rena said without looking up. "CNN wants a sit-down. CBS too. PBS is pitching a retrospective." A doc crew emailed. Jasmine dropped her bag on the desk and sank into her chair. "And let me guess, half of them want me to control the narrative." Rena offered a faint smile. "You're learning." Jasmine leaned back, rubbing her temples. Her phone buzzed another headline with her name in it. She didn't even look. "I knew it would be loud," she murmured, "but not from so many angles." "It's not just about Thomas anymore," Rena said. "You cracked something. And now they're scared of what's behind the next wall." Jasmine stood and moved to the window. Below, a crowd had gathered again holding signs, chanting things she couldn't make out from the fourth floor. Some were angry. Some were cheering. None were quiet. One sign caught her eye. Truth without tone is still truth. Do you think I was too calm? She asked. Rena turned, puzzled. What do you mean? In the hearing, Jasmine said, some people are saying I should have come in harder, called him out directly, made noise. Rena crossed her arms. Look, you didn't shout. You didn't slam the table. You didn't try to steal the spotlight. And that's exactly why it worked. You let the evidence embarrass him, not your voice. Jasmine exhaled slowly. It just doesn't feel like a win. That's because it's not. It's a start, Rena said. Don't confuse a breakthrough with a victory. Later that afternoon, Jasmine sat down behind closed doors with members of the House Ethics Panel. The next phase had already begun. It wasn't a hearing, just a procedural update, but even in that quiet room, the tension was unmistakable. One member, a soft-spoken representative from Vermont, leaned forward. Did you know, he asked, when you presented that last transfer did you know it would lead to him being removed from the building? Jasmine took a beat, weighing her response. I knew it was enough to force a response, she said. I didn't know they'd act that fast. He nodded, slow and deliberate. We've had pieces of this evidence scattered in drawers for years. But it took someone who didn't make it about themselves for people to finally pay attention. After the session, she didn't take the underground tunnel back to her office. She chose the main hall way past the cameras, the stairs, and the whispers. No sunglasses, no entourage, just her, alone. Outside, a reporter was waiting, not a big name, not from cable news. Just a woman with a handheld mic and a notepad. Congresswoman Crockett. She asked softly, what would you say to young women, especially black women, who watched all of this and now believe you've got a target on your back? Jasmine paused, then answered without flinching. I do, she said. But it's been there. It was there the day I ran for office. It was there the first time I asked a question in a room where I wasn't supposed to speak without permission. The reporter didn't interrupt. To those women, Jasmine continued. I'd say this. Being quiet doesn't protect you. Being calm doesn't shield you. What matters is making sure that when your moment comes, you don't waste it trying to make people comfortable. The reporter lowered her mic. Thank you. Jasmine gave a small smile. No. Thank you for not asking what I wore that day. That night, in her apartment, the TV stayed off. She scrolled through public emails instead. One caught her eye. It was from a high school civics teacher in Arizona. My students watched the entire hearing not because I made them, but because they wanted to. You gave them a real-world example of what accountability looks like. And that not yelling doesn't mean you're weak. It means the argument's already been won. She smiled for the first time that day, but she knew it wasn't over. Because if revealing just one truth took this much resistance, the next would demand even more. 3 weeks later, the halls of Congress looked the same. But for Jasmine Crockett, everything had changed. Not in headlines or noise, but in the way people looked at her now. Longer pauses, tighter handshakes. A second glance, not always respect. Sometimes calculation, sometimes quiet resentment. Never indifference, not anymore. She still walked those marble floors the same way. Steady, unscripted, grounded. Only now, every step carried weight. The investigation had widened. Subpoenas were in motion targeting others linked to Veridon Partners LLC. The Florida property was under federal audit. Whistleblowers were stepping forward, workers from the estate. People who'd seen the guest lists remembered the names that never made it to any disclosure form. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't claim credit. She just showed up. 2 committee meetings. 2 briefings. To the same kinds of moments where the real work lives quiet, deliberate, exacting. On a Thursday, she accepted an invitation to speak at a law symposium at American University. No headlines, no fanfare. Students, professors, and a few alumni. In folding chairs, she almost said no. But in the end, she went. The auditorium was full by the time she stepped on stage. No script, no teleprompter. Just a few notes she barely looked at. "I've been asked a lot these past few weeks," she began. "But the one question that keeps coming up isn't about the case. It's not about the hearing. It's this. What did it feel like? Standing up to someone powerful." She paused. "I've thought about that. Hey, honestly, it felt necessary. Not brave, not historic, just necessary." She drew a breath. "We've got to stop treating accountability like it's some kind of miracle. It's not. It's work. Hard, grinding, thankless work. You don't get parades for it. Sometimes you don't even get credit. Sometimes you just get silence, or threats, or people waiting for you to fail." She scanned the crowd. "But I'll tell you what's worse than threats. Knowing you had the chance to speak and chose not to." The room was still. Even the students with their phones out had stopped typing. "The law," she said, "is only as strong as the people willing to test it. No matter how high someone climbs, no matter how protected they are by robes or titles. Or Old Alliance's truth has only one job, to survive long enough to be heard." She ended there. No applause. She walked off the stage and exited through a side door. Outside, the sky was gray. She pulled her coat close and stepped onto the sidewalk. Her phone buzzed. A message from Rena. DOJ just filed formal charge obstruction and false statements. It's official. Jasmine stared at the screen, then locked it. Slid the phone back into her pocket. No smile. No reaction, because real justice doesn't arrive like it does in the movies. It comes slowly, through motions, subpoenas, long days, and even longer silences. Through people who refuse to flinch, not because they want attention, but because they know what it costs to stay quiet. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't afraid of silence. She knew how to wait through it, how to walk straight through it, how to let the truth do what it does best, show up when it's least expected. So what's the lesson? It's this. Titles don't protect the truth. Neither does time. Only people do. People who are willing to stand in uncomfortable rooms, say the quiet part out loud, and endure the noise that follows. Not because they like it, but because staying silent costs more in the long run. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, let this be your reminder. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is speak calmly when the world is begging you not to.